板桥三娘子 The Magic Pancakes at the Footbridge Tavern。
很久很久以前，大约在宋朝的时候，有一家名为板桥客栈的著名旅店。旅店的老板是一位既美丽而又神秘的年轻女子，过路的人都叫她板桥三娘子。没有人知道她的身世，因为她对自己的真名保密。客栈里总是熙熙攘攘，宾客盈门。三娘子欢迎每一位到来的客人，即使是那些付不起钱的人。
A long, long time ago, somewhere around the time of the Song dynasty, there was a famous inn named the Footbridge Tavern. The owner of the inn was a beautiful and yet mysterious young woman, known as Mrs. Number 3 by the passers-by. No one knew much about her background, as she kept her real name a secret. The inn was always bustling with guests, and Mrs. Number 3 welcomed everyone, even those who could not afford to pay.
这位漂亮的客栈老板还在旅店后面的牲口棚里养了许多上好的驴子，这一大群毛驴专门用于出租给客人运载货物。由于那些毛驴长得很壮，也跑得很快，所以生意非常好。但是却从来没有人知道，三娘子的那些毛驴是从哪里来的。
This beautiful innkeeper also had many fine donkeys in stalls behind the inn.This large herd of donkeys was rented out to guests exclusively to carry goods. Because the donkeys were strong and fast, business was very good. But no one ever knew where did Mrs. Number 3's donkeys come from.
一天晚上，有个叫李彤的商人经过这里，看着天色已晚，他便决定在这家客栈住上一晚。李彤刚踏进客栈，三娘子便笑容满面地出来招呼。他最喜欢这种单独上门的客人，他笑嘻嘻地对李彤说：“
大爷，您请坐，我这就给您准备吃的来。”
One night, a merchant named Li Tong passed by. Seeing that it was getting late, he decided to stay at this inn for the night. Just as Li Tong stepped into the inn, Mrs. Number 3 came out to greet him with a wide grin on her face, given that she liked guests who traveled alone the most.She said to Li Tong with a smile,
"Sir, please be seated. I will prepare food for you right away."
李彤才吃过随身携带的干粮，一时还不饿，于是他便告诉三娘子：“
我不想吃东西，只要住一夜，明儿个天亮就走。”
三娘子听了，立刻皱起眉头说：“
真不巧，已经没有空房了。
随便怎么挤一挤都成，天太晚了，怕别的店家也都休息了。”
李彤向三娘子恳求道。三娘子想了一想，说：“
厨房旁边还有个小房间，里面堆了些东西。如果您不嫌弃，我去清理一下，您就委屈一夜吧。”
那就麻烦您了。
李彤高兴地答道。
Li Tong had just taken the snacks that he had brought along, and was not hungry yet. Hence, he told Mrs. Number 3,
"I don't want any food, but would like to stay for the night only and leave at dawn tomorrow."
Hearing this, Mrs. Number 3 immediately frowned and remarked,How
unfortunate. There are no more rooms vacant.
It's too late now. I'm afraid that all the other inns are closing too. Thus please take me in through whatever means.
Li Tong pleaded with Mrs. Number 3. Mrs. Number 3 thought for a moment and said,
There's a small room next to the kitchen with stuff piled up in it. If you don't mind, I'll go and clean it up, so that you can make do for the night.
Sorry for the inconvenience then.
Li Tong replied happily.
这天半夜里，因为天气闷热，李彤烦躁地睡不着。他正觉得口渴，想起伸到厨房去沏壶茶，突然间听到厨房那边传来叽叽咕咕的声音。他心想：
这么晚了，还有谁在厨房呢？
李彤下床走到厨房门口，厨房的门仍紧紧地关着，从门缝中透出一点微弱的烛光。李彤觉得很奇怪，便又凑近了些，想仔细看个究竟。
At midnight, Li Tong was restless and could not sleep due to the hot weather. He was feeling thirsty and wanted to go to the kitchen to get a pot of tea. Suddenly, he heard gibberish noises coming from the kitchen.
Who else could be in the kitchen at this hour of the night?
He thought to himself. Li Tong got out of bed and walked to the kitchen door, which was still closed tightly. Through a narrow slit at the doorway, a little faint candlelight came through. Li Tong thought that it was very strange, so he leaned over, intending to take a closer look.
透过门缝，他看到了他这辈子见过的最奇怪的景象。只见三娘子小心翼翼地从一个木盒子里拿出几只小木偶和一些像玩具似的耕田用具，接着他又向那些东西吹了一口气，口中叽里咕噜地念着什么，就像变戏法一样，所有的小木偶居然活动起来，变成真的人一般。他们有秩序地分工合作，用那些小铲子、小锄头，在厨房的地上耕起田来。一个小人把泥土撒在地上，小牛在泥土上来回拉犁，然后另一个小人从袋子里拿出荞麦种子撒到犁沟里，随后他们又为种子浇水施肥。没过多久，荞麦就长出了小芽。不到1个时辰，那块被小木偶开垦出来的农田里真的长出了一片金黄色的麦穗。荞麦成熟后，小人们拿起镰刀，熟练地割下一串串麦穗，然后迅速启动磨子，将小麦磨成了面粉。
He peeked through the narrow slit and saw the strangest sight that he had ever seen in all his life. Mrs. Number 3 had carefully taken out from a wooden box a few small puppets and some toy-like farming equipment. Then, she blew on them and gabbled something under her breath. As if by magic, all the little figures came to life. They picked up those small shovel, small hoe, and proceeded with an orderly division of labor in plowing the field. One little man scattered dirt on the floor. Tiny oxen drew a plow back and forth over the dirt. Then, from a sack, another little man scattered buckwheat seeds into the furrows. Subsequently, they watered and fertilized the seeds. Soon afterwards, little sprouts came up. In less than an hour, that piece of farmland reclaimed by the little puppets actually did grow a field of golden-colored ears of wheat. With the grains ripened, the little men picked up the scythes and skillfully cut off the bunches of wheat, before quickly setting the mill running and grinding the wheat into flour.
李彤看着三娘子使妖术耕田、制面，心里害怕得不得了，但是他大气不敢出一声，继续躲在门外观察厨房里的情景。面粉做好后，小人们又开始忙着和面、擀面和做饼。整个屋子一时之间充满着香喷喷的气味，香气不断从门缝飘出来。李彤看着三娘子在厨房中指挥着一切，怀疑自己是不是在做梦。但门缝中传出来的烘饼的香气确实那么真实。他倒吸一口冷气，确定自己是闯进了黑店。李彤躲在门外，一直看着那群小人工作完毕，然后他们并列排成一排。只见三娘子像之前一样对着他们吹了一口气，转眼间这些小人儿又变回了木头人。三娘子把他们收进了盒子里，并把盒子盖了起来。待三娘子收拾好东西，李彤才拖着颤抖的双腿，悄悄退回自己所睡的小房间。
Li Tong was extremely frightened as he watched Mrs. Number 3 utilizing demonic techniques to plow the field and make the flour. Nevertheless, he did not dare to make a sound and continued to hide outside the door to observe the scene in the kitchen. When the flour was ready, the little men started to get busy again in kneading the flour, rolling out the dough and making pancakes. All of a sudden, the whole house was filled with a fragrant aroma that kept drifting out from the doorway. Li Tong watched Mrs. Number 3 directing the entire process in the kitchen and wondered if he was dreaming instead. However, the aroma of the baked pancakes coming from the doorway was so real, he gasped as chill ran down his spine and was certain that he had stumbled into an inn that was set out to rob and harm the guests. Li Tong hid outside the door and watched until the group of little men had finished their work. Then, they lined up side by side. Mrs. Number 3 blew on them, exactly as she had done before. In the blink of an eye, the tiny creatures were changed back into wooden figures, which the lady stored away in the box and covered it up. Only after Mrs. Number 3 had packed up her things, did Li Tong drag his trembling legs and quietly retreated to the small room that he was sleeping in.
但是李彤这回再也睡不着了。趁着天还没亮，他提着行囊悄悄从后门溜走了。李彤在夜色中狂奔，一口气跑出了城外。在那儿，他坐在一棵树下，一边喘息一边想，
那些小木偶做的饼，让人吃下去会怎么样呢？
他忍不住好奇心，又偷偷地走回城里。破晓时分，李彤回到客栈门口，板桥客栈的大门还没有开。他悄悄绕到窗下，从窗外向里面看去，只见三娘子正端着几张饼出来给客人当早点。当客人们看到热腾腾、香喷喷的饼时，都迫不及待地伸手去拿。可是吃下肚后不过几秒钟，他们就一个个都抱着肚子叫起来。接着，他们的身体渐渐起了变化，耳朵向上拉长，脸孔也变得很奇怪，全身开始长出棕色的毛。下一秒，他们四肢着地，开始像驴子一样嘶叫起来。不一会儿，5位客人都变成了5头高大、强壮的毛驴。三娘子见状，一边大声笑着，一边用长鞭在他们头顶上抽打，把他们赶到客栈后面的驴棚里。
长夜漫漫，无心睡眠。
But Li Tong could not sleep anymore. Taking advantage of the fact that it was still dark, he took his traveling bag and secretly slipped out from the back door. Li Tong ran frantically in the night without stopping and got out of the city. There, he sat under a tree, gasping for breath while pondering.
What would happen to the people who ate the pancakes made by those little puppets?
He could not curb his curiosity and sneaked back into the city. At the break of dawn, Li Tong returned to the entrance of the inn, where the door of the Footbridge Tavern was not yet opened. He stealthily went under the window and peered into the inn. He saw that Mrs. Number 3 was carrying a few pancakes out to serve as breakfast for the guests. When the guests caught sight of the piping hot, fragrant pancakes, they eagerly reached out and helped themselves to the pancakes. But within seconds of consuming them, they all screamed as they held onto their bellies. Then, their bodies gradually transformed, their ears stretched upwards, their faces became strange, and brown hairs began to grow all over their bodies. In the next instant, they dropped down on all fours and began braying like a donkey. Within a short while, all the 5 guests had turned into 5 big and strong donkeys. Upon seeing this, Mrs. Number 3 laughed out aloud as she cracked her long whip above their heads and drove them out to the donkey stalls behind the inn.
三娘子处理好毛驴，又走进那些客人的房间。她把他们的行李解开，翻找他们的物品，取出里面的金银财宝，收进了自己的房间。然后她才转回到前面，将店面打扫干净，恢复原来的样子。接着，她再打开客栈的门，笑盈盈地迎接新的客人，好像什么事也没有发生过。李彤躲在暗处，亲眼目睹了三娘子利用妖术谋财害命，心里又惊又气。他想，一定要想个办法对付这个女妖精。
After she had settled the donkeys, Mrs. Number 3 went into the rooms of those guests. She unpacked their luggage, rummaged through their belongings to seize the valuables, and put them away in her own room. Only then did she return to the front of the inn, cleaned it up, and restored it to its original state. Then, she opened the door of the inn again, and greeted the new guests with a smile, as if nothing had happened. Li Tong was feeling shocked and angry, as he hid in the shadows, and witnessed Mrs. Number 3 carrying out the demonic acts on her guests. He reckoned that he must think of a way to deal with this demoness.
李彤离开客栈，独自向城外走去。突然，他看到路边有一个卖饼的铺子，那些香喷喷的面饼看起来和三娘子做的一模一样。于是他有了主意，他向那个饼铺老板买了几个饼，放进行囊里。到了傍晚，李彤又回到三娘子的客栈。三娘子看到他，便高兴地迎了上去，说：“
李大爷，你怎么连早点也没吃就出去了？”
对不起，我早上才想起来有急事要办，没给您说一声就走了。现在事情办完了，想再来打扰一晚，不知是否方便？
李彤礼貌地解释道。
没问题。
三娘子笑眯眯地说。她想，昨天没带住这个人，今天时机更好。于是她热情地招呼李彤。
您忙了一天，一定没吃东西，要不先吃张饼？
太好了，我正饿着呢。
李彤回答道。
Li Tong left the inn and walked alone towards the outskirts of the city. Suddenly, he saw a food store selling pancakes by the roadside. Those fragrant pastries looked exactly like the ones made by Mrs. Number 3. As such, he had an idea. He bought a few pancakes from that pancake store owner and put them in his traveling bag. In the evening, Li Tong went back to Mrs. Number 3's inn. When Mrs. Number 3 spotted him, she greeted him with elation.
Mr. Lee, why did you go out without even taking breakfast?
I'm sorry. I just remembered in the morning that I had something urgent and left without informing you. Now that it's done, I'd like to trouble you for another night of stay. Would it be convenient?
Li Tong explained politely.
No problem.
Mrs. Number 3 said with a smile. She figured that if she did not catch this guy yesterday, today would be an even more opportune timing. Therefore, she warmly welcomed Li Tong.
Surely you haven't eaten anything yet after a busy day. Why don't you have a pancake first?
Great, I'm starving.
Li Tong answered.
我去给您热一下。
三娘子非常殷勤的样子。
不用热。
李彤想着他行囊中的那几张饼一定已经凉了，便说：
我喜欢吃凉的。
三娘子端了饼出来。李彤又说：
麻烦来点茶好吗？
李彤等三娘子转身去泡茶的时候，急忙把自己行囊中的那几张饼和盘子里的饼调换了过来。三娘子端茶回来时，李彤便当着三娘子的面拿出袋子里的饼说：
今天中午我在城外也买了几个饼，还没有吃。您要不要吃吃看，比较一下别人做的口味？
好啊。
三娘子大大方方地接过饼来，一口咬下去。李彤举起茶壶，一边倒茶一边说：
我口渴得很，先喝杯茶。
话还没说完，三娘子已经捧着肚子，皱着眉头，像驴子一般爱爱地叫唤起来。瞬间，她的身体开始发生变化。不久之后，她也变成了一头毛驴，就像她先前的客人一样。
I'll heat it up for you.
Mrs. Number 3 appeared to be very hospitable.
There's no need to do so. I like to have it cold.
Li Tong said, thinking that the pancakes in his traveling bag must have gotten cold. Mrs. Number 3 brought out the pancakes. Li Tong added,
Could you please prepare some tea?
As Mrs. Number 3 turned to make tea, Li Tong hastily switched the pancakes in his traveling bag with the ones on the plate. When Mrs. Number 3 returned with the tea, right in front of her, Li Tong then fished out the pancakes from his bag and said,
I was outside the city at noon today, and bought a few pancakes too, which I haven't eaten yet. Would you like to have some to compare the flavors?
Of course.
Mrs. Number 3 graciously took the pancakes and took a bite. Li Tong lifted the teapot and said while pouring the tea,
I'm thirsty, so I'll have a cup of tea first.
Before he could finish his words, Mrs. Number 3 was already holding her tummy, frowning, and braying like a donkey. Instantly, her body began to transform. Soon after, she turned into a donkey as well, just like her former guests.
李彤对着那头毛驴哈哈大笑说：
三娘子啊，三娘子，善有善报，恶有恶报，你终于遭报应了。
然后他拿出一条绳子套住驴头，高兴地牵着毛驴走出店门。这时候李彤再回头一看，客栈已经不见了，剩下的只是一片空地，空地上站了一群傻乎乎不知所措的人。原来这家客栈是三娘子用妖术变的，现在妖术破了，所有的毛驴也就都恢复了人形。李彤向大家讲述了板桥三娘子所施的妖术，大家都对李彤的聪明机警和勇敢的行为感到十分感激。为了报答他的恩情，大家纷纷拿出失而复得的财宝送给他。李彤只挥挥手，笑着提醒大家道：出门在外，
凡事要小心，大家保重啦！天涯海角，但愿有缘再相聚。
说完，便牵着毛驴走出城外。
Li Tong laughed heartily at the donkey and remarked,
Mrs. Number 3? Oh, Mrs. Number 3, what goes around comes around. You finally met your retribution.
Then he took out a rope, put it around the donkey's head, and gleefully led the donkey out of the inn. At this time, Li Tong looked back again and saw that the inn had disappeared. What was remaining was only a vacant lot, with a group of silly, bewildered people standing down there. It turned out that this inn was created by Mrs. Number 3 with her demonic magic. Now that the magic spell was broken, all the donkeys had returned to their human forms. Li Tong told everyone about the demonic spell casted by Mrs. Number 3 of the Footbridge Tavern. Everyone was immensely grateful to Li Tong for his wit and courageous behavior. To repay his kindness, the people took out their recovered valuables to give to him. Li Tong merely waved his hand and reminded everyone with a smile.
Be careful when you're out and about. Everyone, take care. Wherever you may go, hope we'll meet again.
After saying that, he led the donkey out of the city.
Stay tuned for a second version of the story ending. 别走开，这个故事还有第二个版本的结尾哦。
几周后，李彤路过同一条路，快到板桥客栈时，他在村子里的一家铺子买了3个荞麦饼，小心翼翼地放在口袋里。然后他走到客栈前，
李大爷，请进，快请进。
三娘子看到他后喊道：“
您正好赶上吃早餐呢。”
谢谢，我从很远的地方赶来，今早可一定要尝尝你做的美味荞麦饼。
三娘子在她的盘子里堆满了饼，又在自己的盘子里放了3个饼。这时，门前来了一位客人，三娘子离席相迎。
Several weeks later, Li Tong was passing along the same road. As he approached the Footbridge Tavern, he bought 3 buckwheat pancakes from a store in the village and carefully placed them in his pocket. Then he went up to the inn.
Come in, Mr. Lee.
Called out Mrs. Number 3 when she saw him.
You are just in time for breakfast.
Thank you. I have traveled a long distance and shall enjoy your delicious buckwheat pancakes this morning.
Mrs. Number 3 piled cakes high on his plate and put 3 on her own plate. At that moment, a guest arrived at the front door and Mrs. Number 3 left the table to welcome him.
这正是李彤盼望已久的机会。他从口袋里掏出一张在村里买的饼，与一张放在自己盘子里的魔法饼交换。然后他迅速地把那张魔法饼塞进了三娘子的盘子里。
您怎么没吃您的荞麦饼呀，李大爷？
三娘子重新坐到桌边，责备道：“
我在等你。”
他礼貌地回答：“
如果你愿意和我一起吃，我现在就可以吃了。”
您真贴心啊！
他说着，并在桌边坐下。
This was just the opportunity that Li Tong had been hoping for. He took from his pocket one of the pancakes he had bought in the village and exchanged it for one of the magic pancakes on his own plate. Then, he quickly slipped that magic cake onto the plate of Mrs. Number 3.
You are not eating your buckwheat cakes, Mr. Lee.
Chided Mrs. Number 3 as she sat down again at the table.
I was waiting for you.
He answered politely.
I am ready to eat now, if you will eat with me.
That's very sweet of you.
She said, and sat down at the table.
当他的牙齿触碰到魔法饼的那一刻，就像他以前的客人那样，他马上四肢着地，发出爱爱的驴叫声。李彤马上骑上他见过的最漂亮的灰驴离开了。这头驴非常健壮，以至于他在所有的旅行中都会用到它。有一天，李彤路过一座寺庙，一位老道士正站在门口。道士认出这头美丽的驴子就是三娘子，于是他叫李彤停下。他说：“
我知道三娘子耍了很多花招，惹了很多麻烦，但她已经忏悔够久了。现在，让我们来解除令她成为毛驴的魔咒吧。”
于是道士念了一句咒语，驴子的皮突然掉了下来，三娘子就站在他们的面前。他开心地笑了，并感谢老道士破除了魔咒。然后他就沿着蜿蜒的小路走了。从那天起，再也没有人听说过关于板桥三娘子的消息了。
The moment her teeth touched the magic pancake, she immediately dropped down on all fours, braying, just like her former guest. Li Tong promptly rode off on the back of the most beautiful grey donkey he had ever seen. She was so strong that he used her on all his travels. One day, Li Tong was passing by a temple and an old priest was standing at the gate. The priest recognized the beautiful donkey as Mrs. Number 3, and he called to Li Tong to stop.
I know that Mrs. Number 3 played many tricks and caused a lot of trouble, but now she has done penance long enough.
He said,
Let us now break the magic spell that binds her to donkeyhood.
So the priest said a magic word, and the donkey's skin dropped off suddenly. And there stood Mrs. Number 3 before them. She smiled happily as she thanked the old priest for breaking the spell. Then off she went, down the winding road. From that day on, no one has ever heard of Mrs. Number 3 of the Footbridge Tavern again.
Which version of the story endings do you prefer? 你更喜欢哪个版本的故事结局呢？在我们进入下一个故事之前，请先点赞视频并订阅频道哦，谢谢。Before we move on to the next story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel first. Thank you.
The Painted Skin.
画皮。
Once upon a time, long time ago, in ancient China, there was a very studious scholar.
在很久很久以前的中国古代，有一位十分勤奋好学的书生。
One day, he chanced upon a homeless, young girl and was instantly mesmerized by her beauty.
一天，他偶遇了一个无家可归的年轻女孩，便立马被她的美貌迷住。
He took pity on her, brought her home, and hid her in his study room, though he already had a wife.
What?
他觉得女孩很可怜，便将她带回家，藏在书房里，尽管她已经有了妻室。
Needless to say, the wife soon discovered his affair with the homeless girl.
不用说，他的妻子很快就发现了他和那个无家可归的女孩的关系。
你这个忘恩负义、狼心狗肺的家伙，太过分了！
She was furious. However, the scholar simply refused to let go of the pretty girl, as he was greedy.
他很生气，然而贪心的书生并不愿意放弃这个漂亮的女孩。
One day, the scholar bumped into a Taoist priest at the marketplace.
年轻人，你气色欠佳啊！
一天，书生在市集上碰到了一位道士。
The priest told the scholar that he had been possessed by a demon and that his life was in grave danger.
道士告知书生，他被妖怪附身，危及性命。
Nevertheless, the scholar did not take heed of the priest's warning and just brushed it off.
然而，书生并未听从道士的警告，只是一笑置之。
大傻蛋！
When the scholar went home, he found the gates were locked, but he managed to get into the house.
书生回到家时，发现大门紧锁， 但他还是设法进入了家中。
Peeking through the window of his study room, to his horror, he saw that the pretty girl was actually a green-faced monster, a demon with great jagged teeth, like a saw.
透过书房的窗户，他惊恐地看到，那个漂亮的女孩实际上是个脸碧绿色、牙齿相锯的怪物。
All this while, she had been wearing a mask made of human skin, on which her startling, attractive features were painted.
原来，她一直都戴着一个画着姣好面容的人皮面具。
Horrified, the scholar ran to the priest for help.
被吓破胆的书生连忙跑到道士那里求助。
The priest agreed and offered the scholar a charm meant to ward off demons.
过来啊！
道士答应出手，并向他提供了一个驱魔的符咒。
The scholar returned home and obediently hung the charm outside his bedroom.
书生回到家里，乖乖地把符咒挂在卧房外。
Alas, the charm had no effect on the demon at all.
想不到，符咒对妖怪一点效应都没有。
Instead, it threw into a rage and ripped out the scholar's heart.
Oh my
God! 反之，妖怪勃然大怒，愤而撕裂了书生的胸膛，并取走了其心脏。
Now, this time round, it was the scholar's wife who quickly ran to the priest for help.
这次，轮到书生的妻子跑到道士那里寻求帮助。
Together, they found that the demon had disguised as an elderly helper working at the scholar's brother's place.
他们发现，原来妖怪已乔装成老妇人，去到书生的弟弟家做帮佣了。
Without any mercy this time round, the priest launched a full-scale attack at the demon.
这次道士不再心存怜悯，并向妖怪发动全面攻击。
Soon, the demon reverted to its original form, and the priest beheaded it with his wooden sword.
很快，妖怪被打回了原形，道士用木剑将其斩杀。
The demon's remains dissolved into puffs of green smoke, which the priest hastily stored into his calabash.
妖怪的遗体化为一缕缕青烟，道士匆忙将烟吸进他的葫芦之中。
Next, he rolled up the demon's painted skin like an art scroll and kept it away from sight.
随即，他像剪发般将人皮剪好，以便眼不见为净。
Next, the scholar's wife begged the priest to revive her husband.
Please, I beg you.
接着，书生的妻子恳求道士把她的丈夫救活。
求你了，我求求你了。
The priest told her to look for a lunatic beggar at the marketplace and do whatever he asked her to do.
道士让他去市集上找一个疯癫的乞丐，并做他所要求的任何事情。
切记，你一定要照我说的去做。
As it turned out, the beggar treated the scholar's wife with extreme disrespect and scolded her profusely.
结果，这个乞丐对书生的妻子极其不尊重，并对他大加责骂。
She did not retort, and instead patiently pleaded with him for help.
他并没有反驳，而是耐心地恳求他帮忙。
求求你，救救我的相公！你让我做什么，我都愿意。
And you know what happened next? The beggar coughed out some phlegm and asked her to swallow it.
你知道接下来怎么了吗？乞丐咳出了一些痰，并让他吞下。
Ew, so disgusting， 真恶心啊！
For the love of her dead husband, she did as what she had been told, and after that, returned home disappointedly.
书生的妻子救夫心切，便照做了，但之后却失望地回了家。
During the funeral preparations, the scholar's wife suddenly felt extremely nauseous and vomited out a heart into the dead scholar's open wound.
在准备葬礼的过程中，书生的妻子突然感觉恶心作呕，并向已死去的书生的伤口处呕吐出了一颗人心。
Slowly, but miraculously, the scholar came back to life.
Nice.
慢慢的，书生竟奇迹般的复活了。
Moral of the story: do not go for extramarital affairs, and treat the people that truly matter to you fairly and hold them close to your heart. Remember to hug your loved ones and say I love you to them every day. Finally, if you've enjoyed the story, please like, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Till next time.
这个故事的寓意是：路边的野花不要采，千万别去搞婚外情。对你真正重要的人，要好好珍惜和用心地对待他们，也要记得每天拥抱你的家人哦，并时常对他们说声我爱你。最后，如果你喜欢这个故事，请点赞、订阅并点击小铃铛。我们下次再会，拜拜。